Well, welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. This is a lecture today. Will be our first lecture on ancient and medieval views on the nature of wisdom. This is part of a longer lecture series where we started the whole thing off by thinking about creativity. It's kind of a hip topic these days in education. The big man in the field who probably many of you have been exposed to in Bachelor of Education programs is a guy by the name of Sir Ken Robinson. Good speaker. I've seen him many times at teachers' conventions and places like this. Ken's got his own take on it. I've got a different take. I think creativity is certainly a good thing. But I've been trying to press everybody who's listening to the lectures just to think about how creativity perhaps is not an unmitigated good. It's not a good all the time, right? Like you can probably think of plenty of examples of creativity from days gone by that didn't work out so well, you know. Anyway, the point is that really the missing link in education is wisdom. Wisdom is, if there is any good that is good and it's always good, it would be wisdom. Now, what I've tried to do is suggest to you that it's important for us as teachers to think about cultivating wisdom's pursuit in our classrooms, not just in our classrooms, but in our own personal lives. And of course, hopefully, we can whet the appetite of our students to do so as well. This is how we'll pursue happiness and how they'll pursue happiness. And what's the point of all this stuff we're doing in schools if it's not, to at the end of the day or at the end of the life to be able to look back and affirm it all as being good and worthwhile and having a sense of its meaning, right? So, that is the grand picture of education that's I'm trying to portray to you here. And then, of course, we went on from there thinking about, so we want to foster creativity, but let's put that aside until we figure out what wisdom is. If we're pursuing wisdom and we're doing it creatively, hey, excellent, right? So what I started off by doing was offering you up a few basic terms that have been lost in the mists of time, that different words that people have used in ancient and medieval times that may help us think more clearly about wisdom and what wisdom is and how to pursue it and who we are, right? Because that's what this is all about, folks, is self-knowledge, right? Then we moved on from thinking about those terms. We moved on to thinking about, well, what are the more typical, modern ways that we think about what wisdom is. We use the term. It's not like we have forgotten about wisdom, but we just don't necessarily have a good, clear vision of it. So I wanted to expose you to a number of different big ideas about what wisdom is today, things that are still being talked about in scholarship, and then how these things figure in education. If we take them as the truth about wisdom, maybe some of the problems or misconceptions that would arise, especially in a school system or whatever. So we've done all that, and here we are now. I'd like to, as a counterpoint to that, introduce you to some ancient views of wisdom, and I'd like to start with Aristotle on what wisdom is. Now, we talked about wisdom classically as Sophia. That's the Greek word for wisdom. He distinguishes two different uses of the word Sophia or wisdom. First, he says Sophia is employed to denote those men who are the most perfect masters of their art, such as master craftsmen or experts. So he's a wise carpenter, or he's a wise farmer, or he's a wise, shoemaker or something, right? Like you're good at what you do, and because you're expert at it, we use the term wisdom, right? Got a lot of wisdom in that field. Another way that we also use it is we think about people who are wise in general. not in any one department of knowledge. So such people, we often say, must be possessed of the most perfect sort of knowledge. So that's a different kettle of fish, isn't it? The truly wise man, or the Greek word here is sophos, therefore must have knowledge not only of the conclusions that follow from first principles, those foundational ideas or things that, all of our other knowledge rests on. We build everything else up off those foundational first principles that we take in, right? So you must not only have knowledge of the conclusions that follow from these things, he must also know the truth about those first principles or those archai themselves. See? So he takes those things up, right? Whatever your first principle is, he asks about that first principle, about the truth of that first principle in relation to the big truth, right? Or its ground. Hence, wisdom is not simply what we might call scientific knowledge of the principles that form the basis of for activities and inquiry in the various studies and arts in which human beings might engage. It's not good enough simply to have a knowledge of these archai and how to apply them. That's what we do lots, isn't it? When we're learning math in school, for instance, generally what we're doing is here's the principles, ladies and gentlemen, or maybe we discover them, right? Maybe, like if you're a good science teacher, you don't just stand up there and say, okay, well, here's the first law, or here's the second law. You run an experiment and the kids go, wow, and then they discover the first principle and then they learn how to apply it and fiddle around with it and build stuff. And that's typically what we do in schools. But this is not the same thing as what Aristotle is suggesting here when we actually seek after wisdom. So it's not simply what we might call scientific knowledge of the principles that form the basis for activities and inquiry in the various studies and arts in which we engage. It's not good enough simply to have a knowledge of these archai and then know how to apply them or build stuff using them. You understand that? To be wise, one must know what relation these archai bear to the truth. And the Greek word for truth is aletheia. That is, one must know how the various archai are themselves related to the one divine beginning, or arche, here referred to by Aristotle as mind, or intellect, or the Greek word is nous. This is why he calls Sophia a combination of nous and knowledge of the most exalted objects, inasmuch as one takes up, and here's the word anheiresis again, takes up the most exalted objects of knowing towards their first principle in the divine, one shares to the extent possible for a mortal being in the immortal nous through one's own noetic activity. For the human nous, our share in what is immortal, is only a reflection of the divine nous. Okay? So, using our minds, or allowing our minds to operate in this way, cultivating this operation of our minds, is kind of a divine activity, says Aristotle. Okay, well, remember from earlier lessons and lectures, we talked about Sophia and Phronesis and how these two things denote different aspects of wisdom. Let's talk about that again in Aristotle's terms. Having offered an overarching explanation of the nature of Sophia, Aristotle next designs to distinguish it from practical wisdom, prudence, or phronesis, a quality here also identified with political science. Unlike Sophia, phronesis does not concern what is most serious, since human affairs are certainly not the highest thing in the cosmos. Do you remember Plato? I mentioned this earlier. He says nothing in the world is serious. No, nothing human is serious. Now, we're the stuff of comedy, right? But the only thing that's really serious is the gods or the god. So Sophia has to do with that, but phronesis doesn't, because it has to do with human affairs. See? In fact, Aristotle points out that phronesis need not even be construed as a distinctly human excellence or virtue. Rather, it's a kind of knowing of what is good that human beings share with all complex sentient beings. Okay, so it's kind of a lower thing, isn't it? Just as a prudent human being knows and is able to act in a good way, so too do animals share in phronesis, inasmuch as they display a capacity for forethought, right? Thinking ahead, planning ahead, as regards their own lives. In this respect, phronesis is depicted as quite a low and common thing, very different from Sophia. Aristotle offers us more assistance as we attempt to understand prudence in its human form as a quality distinct from Sophia. As we have seen, on the one hand, phronesis, as the capacity for effective use of forethought, is an attribute shared by both humans and other animals. Certainly at this level, and to this extent, phronesis could be cultivated in schools. You could think about how to engender in my students more foresight, right? Lots of programs developed by psychologists and education experts. This is the sort of wisdom, I guess, that they're interested in. I remember we looked at Robert Sternberg when we were talking about the moderns, and Sternberg has that wisdom program with his own middle school kids. This is what it's aimed at, is foresight, kind of lower stuff. On the other hand, phronesis can also connote the good habit of mind. That is the same as political science. In this second sense, phronesis is the knowledge and ability to achieve our highest end as human beings engaged in human affairs together, seeking out a modicum of happiness that is afforded to us. Right? At a certain point, Aristotle says that the highest happiness for human beings, as mortal beings, is through, politics. They're political animals, right? So politics is all about achieving, the common end, the common good. Not just thinking about myself or you thinking about yourself, but all of us thinking together, how can we be happy? How can we get along? How can we live a good life together, right? So that's a practical affair. That's phronesis. Do you see? So as we shall see, in this sense of phronesis, it is this sense of phronesis that Aristotle suggests is problematic with regard to youthful instruction. Like, can youth really do this, right? They don't have enough life experience, he wants to say. They don't make good politicians. Although I don't know if older people make good politicians either. However, further difficulties in understanding Aristotle's sense of the distinction between Sophia and phronesis now begin to emerge from the fact that the supreme good, or the ariston, is the ultimate object of both Sophia and phronesis. For Sophia is the quality of knowing the ariston, and yet it is also clear to Aristotle that the human being is a political animal whose ultimate happiness is to be achieved through political science, or a knowing of political things. How can both these things be simultaneously? And this is a good question. Lots of people just get pissed off with or impatient with the idea of Sophia. Like, why would I need that anyway? That just sounds like a lot of hocus pocus and God stuff, and let's toss that out and we can just focus on politics and getting along, right? That's part of the reason why moderns just have no patience for Sophia anymore, and they just try to focus on phronesis on its own. But Aristotle would say that's ridiculous, right? You're throwing out the baby with the bathwater when you toss out Sophia. The confusion that is possible here arises from lack of clarity concerning the claim that human beings have a share in both the mortal and the immortal. Their mortal share of happiness being attained through phronesis, right, or political science in the practical life, and their immortal share of happiness through schole and the cultivation of Sophia in the contemplative life. Those words we talked about quite a bit in some of the earlier lectures, in case you've forgotten. According to Aristotle, the contemplative life transcends the merely human level. We can lead it only insofar as we are more than merely mortal.
only insofar as something divine is really present within us. Aristotle calls this divine part, in the composite nature of the human being, mind, intellect, or nous. And he writes that the life of the intellect is divine, as compared with life on the merely human level of practical excellences. Hence, we must not follow the advice of those who would enjoin us to think only of human things because we are human, and only of mortal things because we are mortals. Here, you should recall our discussion of modern thought that dismisses concerns for Sophia in education, right? It's our duty to make ourselves immortal, or rather to realize, I guess, right? Realize that element of ourselves that is immortal. You don't make yourself immortal, that's poorly put. To realize this as far as is possible in this life by cultivating the activity of the best part in us, which may be called our better or true self. Aristotle points out that the nous is the orienting or ruling part in our soul, and it would be strange indeed if man should choose not to live the life of his own self, but that of something else. In short, whereas the end of action, or praxis, is to attain the highest end for human beings as both mortal and human, the end of Theoria, or the kind of seeing that is cultivated through leisure, is Sophia. And this end is not specific to human beings insofar as they are merely mortal, but rather to the extent that they participate in what is immortal and divine. This is why Aristotle calls the act of pursuing wisdom or philosophizing noetic inquiry into the ground of being, he calls it immortalization. Big word there. Now, having discussed the various meanings of phronesis, the term for practical wisdom, including its ultimate manifestation as the mastercraft, right? If you're taking political science, that's what you learn political science is, the mastercraft. Aristotle emphatically states that the young are not fit to be students of political science, which kind of rings true with me in my 20s. His reasoning is that each man judges correctly those matters with which he is acquainted, and that youth are acquainted with very little due to their lack of experience in living. If you want to see how this plays out, there's this really great dialogue by Plato. It's called the Lysis, and in that there's these two kids. They're little kids. They're not even teenagers, right? So, but Plato's talking with them, and the one boy, Plato's talking with him, Socrates is talking with him, and he asks the one boy, so, your dad loves you, right? And he's like, yeah, my dad loves me, and when you get to be of age, he's going to probably respect you more because you'll know more stuff, right? And yeah, that's right. And so, well, what if you start knowing more than your father knows about what's good and what's just and how to get along in, say, his business? Do you think he's going to just leave it to you? Hand it over to you? And he's, oh yeah, of course, if I know more and I can do a better job of it, of course my dad's going to give it to me, right? So a bit of naivety there. And then he extrapolates from there, and he starts talking about, was it Xerxes or something like this? Anyway, a great Persian, the big Persian king at the time. And he says, so, what if you became renowned for wisdom and you became really wise, and you went to the court of the Persian king, and you were wiser than him? Do you think he would hand over power to you so that you could, because you'd do a better job? Oh yeah, sure, Socrates. Of course he would do that, right? So this is just an example, right, of how there's a certain way in which the kids can follow Socrates' reasoning with them, and they can do a certain amount of this, but there are life experiences that they're lacking, right? The life experience of, this element of human pride, right? They really don't yet get how the world works and how people are assholes. They don't understand that yet, and they don't see the folly, just the sheer folly of other people, and not just other people, but of their own selves, right? So this takes a while. It takes some bruises in life, and I think that's why Aristotle just says, young people are just not fit for political science, and they're not really fit for this idea of prudence or phronesis. Moving on then, to criticize a particular subject, a man must have been trained in that subject, but youth have not yet received sufficient training or developed such competencies. To be a good critic, he must have had an all-round education, but youths are not yet so educated. That's true. Hence, lacking sufficient experience of things that supply the premises and subject matter of political science, young people are incapable of its study. Moreover, Aristotle notes that youth are led by their feelings, so that they will study political science to no purpose or advantage. And these cautions against attempting to instruct young people in practical wisdom are not simply ageist. Aristotle remarks that the defect is not a question of time, that one can be young or old in years, but still be immature in character. I'm sure you've run across enough people in your time, ladies and gentlemen, that are old, but they have not seemed to learn anything from their experiences, right? This is essentially what Aristotle's saying here. Okay, so as we've seen, most of the modern authors surveyed in this course reject any role for Sophia in education, right? However, all of them are in agreement that phronesis is of vital importance, and although they disagree on the extent to which it can be taught, they nonetheless all agree that wisdom's pursuit ought to be encouraged in schools. And yet Aristotle's emphatic that practical wisdom or phronesis is not amenable to the life experiences and character of youth. See? So it's back-ass words from us modern people. Young people, in Aristotle's view, are unsuited to studies in the formation and cultivation of prudent action without first attending to the cultivation of ethical or moral virtues that regulate their appetites. For this reason, Aristotle recommends instruction in moral science as a precursor to the study of political science. You could see this playing out in your own classroom, right? Suppose you were having a class and you were talking about being good to one another and understanding. You give scenarios, say like Sternberg, you're given scenarios about, how ought we act in X situation? What's the ethical or moral way to act? And kids can come up with the answer to these sorts of things, or workable answers, or understandable, thoughtful answers. But then, they go out in the hallway and they bully each other, and they, maybe do something mean to somebody else, in other words, I'm just saying that Aristotle says that, really what has to come first is some kind of education in ethical or moral virtues. Because otherwise, all this talk and this understanding is just, it's empty. It's abstract. It isn't really lived. You see? So, a good question here for you. Is there something more amenable to youthful interest and experiences in the spirit of wisdom's pursuit as Sophia than as phronesis, right? If kids, says Aristotle, are not so yet built for phronesis because they don't have the life living behind them, what about Sophia? The cultivation of Sophia is a kind of leisured activity. It's not directed at the world of action or of work as a form of education. It's more like what children do when they engage in play, right? And it's an activity that is pursued for its own sake, unlike either action or work, right? We act in order to. We work in order to. And in principle, at least, it ought to be what we do with children when they're in school and engaged in scholastics. After all, these words are not, at their root, amenable to the notion of education as work, but rather as schole, or leisured activity in the cultivation and pursuit of Sophia. Moreover, one pursues Sophia as one pursues trying to recollect and articulate a reasoned account of originary experience, in particular the experience of wonder, or thauma. As is well known, children, and especially very young ones, are naturally full of wonder about the world. Indeed, these observations about the amenability of children to philosophy in principle illuminate why the majority of Socrates' philosophic discussions are not with the very old, or the middle-aged, or even the mature men, but with young men who are of the age just to begin growing facial hair. In fact, again, I think I mentioned this to you before, some of the dialogues, such as the Lysis, are conducted with children, not yet having reached puberty. The pursuit of Sophia, therefore, seems to be more amenable to the education of youths and children than the pursuit of Phronesis. And yet here, too, Aristotle voices reservations about any education of the youth aimed at Sophia. Here's what he writes. One might indeed further inquire why it is that, though a boy may be a mathematician, he cannot be wise or a physician. That is, one having knowledge of being, as it's derived from Theoria, related to the examination of nature, or phusis. Perhaps the answer is that mathematics deals with abstractions, whereas first principles are derived from experience. The young can only repeat them without trusting in their truth, whereas the formal concepts of mathematics are easily understood. So he says, basically, young people aren't fit for either form of wisdom. Although reservations concerning instruction and philosophy are strongly voiced in Plato's dialogues as well, Aristotle's remarks about the inaccessibility of philosophy for children and young people are of significantly different character here. Whereas in the dialogues, it's assumed that all humans, young or old, have originary experiences and are able to recollect such experiences at the beginning of the beginning things, or the first things. Aristotle contends that such anamnetic experiences are beyond the reach of youth, and therefore that Socrates' dialogues with the young are somehow misplaced, or directed at an audience by its own nature incapacitated for such pursuits and inquiries. So there is some conflict here, ladies and gentlemen, between Plato and Aristotle on these things, right? Aristotle states that instruction of youth in political science or prudence is misplaced, as it demands them to employ understandings that are beyond their experiential capacities. He argues that the cultivation of moral or ethical virtue among the youth must precede any such studies. Little Peanuts cartoon here for you. You can see Linus there. He says, "I can't stand it." In comes Charlie Brown. And there's Lucy saying, "Happiness is getting all your Christmas thank you letters written." And then, Charlie Brown comes in to see Linus. "Hi, Charlie Brown, come on in. See? Just like I told you, look at all this stuff. A bicycle, games, clothes, baseball, equipment." Linus isn't happy about this. "More clothes, more toys, candy, books, a transistor radio. This is terrible. This is my worst Christmas yet." See, and Lucy, she's already said happiness is getting all your Christmas thank you letters written. "How will I develop any character? I always get everything I want." So Linus is basically thinking that, this is such a curse, getting everything I want, that, really character is the foundational thing for happiness. All this, he recognizes that just this accumulation of goods, this acquisition that we all, think is somehow related to happiness in our culture and in our society, Linus sees through it, and he sees that this is like a curse to him. I think Aristotle might find that funny. Anyway, Aristotle attempts an explanation of the relation between the moral virtues, right? Things like, temperance, not getting everything you want all the time, and practical wisdom, or phronesis, by first restating the problem. He defines virtue as what secures the rightness in our choice of an end, right? So virtue is what secures the rightness of our choice in an end. It finds the correct end for us. That's what virtue is all about. Okay? But to do the actions that must in the nature of things be done in order to attain the end we have chosen is not a matter for virtue, but for a different faculty. So if virtue spies out what the end is, what the good end of a thing is, how do I get from where I am to that end? Need a different virtue for that, right? Or a different faculty. So what is the precise relation between moral virtue, right, finding these good ends, and phronesis? Well, by his earlier assessment that young people are unfit for the pursuit of prudence as political science, Aristotle perhaps suggests that the establishment of moral virtue must precede prudence, and therefore that prudence depends upon moral virtue. Indeed, Aristotle says as much when he writes that the eye of the soul cannot acquire the quality of prudence without possessing virtue. Moral virtue, or the right ordering of the soul's appetites according to good ends, is presumed by the existence of phronesis, which, without awareness of such ends, would not know the means whereby to achieve them. Okay, so phronesis, there's the answer, right? How do you get from point A to point B? Picking the correct means, that's phronesis. Phronesis allows you to find the correct means to find to the end that moral virtue has demonstrated for you. In support of this contention, he writes that the supreme good, or the Ariston, only appears good to the good man. Depravity perverts the soul and causes it to hold false views about the first principles of conduct. Hence, it is clear that we cannot be prudent without being good. However, Aristotle seems unhappy with the view that the other moral virtues could exist without phronesis to help them achieve the ends they spy. Phronesis is unique in being both a moral virtue that provides effective means for the appetitive elements of the soul to achieve their good ends, as well as being an intellectual virtue. It's both, see? For it is the excellence of the practical intellect. In his view, then, it's not proper to say that all virtues are forms of phronesis, for only prudence occupies this position as a virtue of both the intellect and the appetitive soul. But it is correct to say that the moral virtues cannot exist without phronesis. Aristotle attempts to explain how it can be both be and not be the case that the presence of other moral virtues is necessary for prudence to exist on the one hand, and that prudence is necessary for the moral virtues to exist on the other. This is always confusing, right? You need prudence, don't you, in order to have virtue, because virtue is about attaining this right end, but yet prudence is something that seems to come later, so how do you have moral virtue at an earlier age, or it's like, how does all this work? Because that seems kind of silly too. This is how do we deal with this tangled mess? He does so by distinguishing between what he calls natural virtue and authoritative virtue. Natural virtues exist in the souls, even of wild animals and children, as natural dispositions. Much as Aristotle earlier conceded that phronesis of a kind exists anywhere the capacity for forethought is displayed as regards one's own life. However, without intelligence, these natural capacities or abilities to attain desires or the desired ends, may be manifestly harmful. So whereas the natural virtue or capacity to attain desired ends may be present without phronesis, true or authoritative virtue that involves choosing rightly in order to attain a good end cannot exist without phronesis. You can read that again if it's confusing to you, or we can talk about it in class. In this way, Aristotle contends that it's not possible to be good in the true sense without phronesis, nor to be prudent without moral virtue. You need both of them, see? Aristotle uses his distinction between natural virtue and authoritative or true virtue also to explain a peculiar difficulty in deciding whether the virtues can exist in isolation from each other. Can you have courage, right, but not temperance? Or can you have justice but not liberality or something like that? Or whether or not, if anyone has a single one, he possesses all of them necessarily as well, right? Oh, if I've got justice, then I must have every other damn virtue, right? Aristotle writes that in regard to the natural virtues, it's possible to have one without possessing the others, just as someone might have a natural capacity for one thing but not another thing. But it's not possible in regard to those virtues which entitle a man to be called good without qualification. For if a man have the one virtue of phronesis, he'll also have all the moral virtues together with it. Okay? This is kind of complicated stuff, isn't it, thinking about virtue? But, I mean, I don't want you to be deluded in thinking this doesn't have any place in education, because, all these thinkers that we've been studying in our courses together, or even, what are you doing in school if you're not concerned with virtue, with excellence, right? So it's good for us as teachers in training to think about virtue. And Aristotle's good at doing that, helping us do that. Okay, so what's the point of Sophia if phronesis and moral virtue seem to cover everything that matters, right? I don't know if you were thinking about that, but if phronesis finds the correct means to the end, and if moral virtue finds the correct end, then what the hell is the point of Sophia? Doesn't it seem like, an add-on, like an air spoiler on the back of a Hyundai or something? Like, who needs that? Get that off of there. Given Aristotle's account of phronesis as the possession of all the other moral virtues in their authoritative as opposed to merely natural form, one is left still with a second perplexity, namely, of what use is Sophia, given the scope of phronesis in ordering the lives of human beings? And how could it possibly be that phronesis is inferior in rank to Sophia? Aristotle ends Book 6 of his Nicomachean Ethics concerning the nature of wisdom simply by saying, it's not really the case that phronesis is in authority over Sophia, or over the higher parts of the intellect, any more than medical science is in authority over health. In his view, to suppose that phronesis is superior to Sophia would be akin to saying that political science, or phronesis, governs the gods as well as men. All right, so there's a simple answer from Aristotle about, the relation between these two terms for wisdom. Now, it's important to examine what Aristotle says about the pursuit of each kind of wisdom. In our review of modern writers on the subject of wisdom, the subject of a wisdom atmosphere arose. Is there a similar concern for atmosphere or environment in Aristotle's writings on the pursuit of Sophia? To what extent would securing such an atmosphere be essential for the cultivation of wisdom in a modern school context? if indeed such an ambition is even realistic or appropriate. In order to respond to these questions, we must examine what Aristotle refers to as the two lives in which the great goods of wisdom are pursued, and the extent to the extent possible for a human being. These manners of living are referred to by Aristotle as the active and contemplative lives. Aristotle begins Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics with a discussion of the significance of pleasure, which the Greek word is hedone, or we get our hedonism or hedonistic from, right? Someone who just lives the life of pleasure. So he wants to talk about pleasure in human life, and in particular, the role that pleasure plays in education. Here's what he says. Pleasure is thought to be especially congenial to the human race, and this is why pleasure and pain are employed in the education of the young, as a means whereby to steer their course. Moreover, to like and to dislike the right things is thought to be a most important element in the virtue, or in the development of moral virtue. The problem, of course, is that many like or rejoice in the wrong things and hate things that ought not to be hated. Right? Pleasure, or hedone, ought not to be understood as the good. Some people get it mixed up, that whatever gives me pleasure must be good. And not every pleasure is desirable. However, it's also true that there are certain pleasures superior in respect of their specific quality or their source that are desirable in themselves. Aristotle next turns to an examination of the nature of these pleasures that are desirable in themselves. First, he begins by noting an important association between pleasure and seeing. The act of seeing appears to be perfect at any moment of its duration. That is, sight attains directly and completely to what is seen for as long as it sees, right? It requires no mediating faculty or power, but it is a kind of direct apprehension or knowing, wherein the seer and the seen are melded together in the most perfect knowing. Aristotle remarks that pleasure also appears to be a thing of this nature. Inasmuch as it is akin to seeing, it attains to its object in a unity, as the pleasured is to the pleasuring without mediation, and for as long as the union remains in duration. Okay, so he sees a real resonance between the idea of seeing and pleasure. Second, Aristotle considers pleasure using the metaphors of movement and rest. He decides that pleasure is most akin to a form of rest rather than movement, since every motion, and the word there is kinesis, we get our word kinetic from that, right? Since every motion involves duration and is a means to an end, whereas the pleasure that Aristotle seeks out is desirable for itself. As a means to an end, motion is not perfect because it points beyond itself for its satiation. Moreover, motion is not perfect at every moment, and that many movements which make up the whole are imperfect. However, the specific quality of pleasure, on the contrary, is perfect at any moment, inasmuch as it is a perfect having of the desired. Consequently, it is clear that pleasure is not the same as motion, and that it is a whole and something perfect. Okay, do you see the reasoning there? Next, Aristotle develops his analysis of the metaphor of the senses and seeing as a way to talk about the intellect's beholding of the best of its objects. He writes, inasmuch as Each of the senses acts in relation to its object and acts perfectly when it is good, in a good condition and directed to the finest of the objects that belong to it. It follows that the activity of any of the senses is at its best condition when the sense organ, being in the best condition, is directed to the best of its objects, and this activity will be the most perfect and the pleasantest. For each sense has a corresponding pleasure, as also have thought and speculation, and its activity is pleasantest when it is most perfect, and most perfect when the organ is in good condition and when it's directed to the most excellent, most serious of its objects, and the pleasure perfects the activity. That's a lot of goodness and bestest and pleasantest and everything, but you can go through and read that again if you'd like. So anyway, if we follow Aristotle's rich use of the sensory metaphor here carefully, we can see its relevance and application in the field of education. Seeing, beholding, or theoria may indeed have its ultimate object or perfection in the visio beatifica, or the beatific vision, right? But Aristotle certainly does not limit its relevance to the soul that is perfect in its attainment of the divine vision. Theoria is not, as modern authors, and even as a great many ancient critics have claimed it to be, it's not an elitist affair for only the most spiritually refined and capable. Rather, Theoria is a quality of existence, enjoyed and enjoyable by all human beings, even at the level of sensory perception. And certainly it is a mode of existence and a kind of pleasure that is open to and inviting for students of all ages. Like Snoopy there. All the authors in our study, be they ancients or moderns, agree that if education is of any value to a human life, it must in some sense contribute to our happiness. In light of this discussion of pleasure, Aristotle investigates its relation to happiness in the lives of human beings. Life, and the Greek word here is zoe. Right? Maybe you know a zoe. I've taught a few zoes. Life, states Aristotle, is an activity, or an energy, that each of us exercises upon those objects and with those faculties that we most enjoy. That's what life is. The pleasure we derive from such activities perfects them, and therefore perfects life, which is what all human beings seek. This is why, even though Aristotle has said that pleasure is not akin to motion, there is no pleasure without activity, and also no perfect activity without its pleasure. Of course, as any school teacher knows, people take pleasure in and pursue all sorts of things, many of which are not good, or less good than they suppose. However, Aristotle points out that in all such cases, the thing really is what it appears to be to the spoudeos. All right, so, lots of us are confused, and we get our order of goods, and we think we overestimate the goodness of a thing, or we underestimate the goodness of a thing, or whatever. Not everybody's as confused as that. He says the spoudios, this is some such person. Spoudios is a Greek word. It means the mature man or the serious man. All right, so someone who's got it together, the good or the excellent man, one at any rate who knows and is properly serious about serious things, but also unserious about unserious things. Right? Maybe one who doesn't take himself so seriously, I don't know. The spoudios, unlike the rest of us, always takes appropriate pleasure in the right sorts of things, and no pleasure in inappropriate things. Unfortunately, the spoudios is a rather rare individual. No guff. So the question becomes, How do we as teachers and students come into the knowledge that the spoudios has of the right relation of pleasure to its true objects? How are the pleasures, which serve as the prime motivating factor behind all the ambitions and activities in which students demonstrate eagerness to be related to their overall happiness? Certainly, if wisdom or Sophia is to have any relevance to our lives and education, it must have some bearing upon our ability to live happily, right? What good is it if it doesn't do that? Well, in Aristotle's view, happiness is not a certain disposition of character, since if it were, someone who remained asleep for his or her entire life could be happy, as could one who was plunged into the greatest misfortune. Happiness must rather be some form of activity. Right? Happiness is an activity. It's not a disposition, it's an activity. In particular, it must be an activity that is not a means to some other end, but one that is an end in itself. For happiness lacks nothing and is self-sufficient. That makes sense? As we mentioned earlier, play, or paideia, is one such activity desirable for its own sake. And yet, Aristotle is emphatically unwilling to say that play is the same as happiness. Rather, in his view, paideia is very much the same as a trifling pastime, or a diagoge. It is a pretense to leisure, or schole, that is cultivated by those who would squander their health and their estates. All right, he thinks if you're playing, you're kind of wasting your time. You're just frittering things away. Get down to being serious. In Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, play is criticized as an affectation of those who are either insufficiently serious about worldly affairs, or else they take pleasure in depraved things that are not really pleasant but rather disgraceful. Goofing off, right? Here the playful immature man is counterposed directly with the serious or mature man, the spoudios. Indeed, at least on the surface, the word play is the direct opposite of seriousness. Right? So no wonder the serious man is not playful, I guess, right? No playing! Perhaps part of Aristotle's distaste for paideia as diagoge, or as a, just pastime, is that it is time-centered. That is, the man engaged in diagoge seems to be oblivious to what is not centered in time. The pastime is both a squandering of life's resources as well as the time given to us all that we might use in the cultivation of higher activities of the mind. One who simply passes the time or kills time, right, has little or no regard for such timeless concerns. Indeed, Aristotle has earlier related Theoria and the pursuit of Sophia to the cultivation of a pleasure that is for its own sake, and that does not have its grounding in time, but rather outside of time. Theoria and its pleasures are therefore quite different than time-wasting or killing time with idle pursuits, in Aristotle's view. You see that? These criticisms of diagoge are certainly well placed by Aristotle when directed at such men. But they don't deal exhaustively with the full range of activities that are encompassed by the word play. Look at Calvin and Hobbes. They're playing. Most notably, it seems peculiar that Aristotle's remarks in this passage about what he sees as a false relation between paideia and happiness make no mention of play in its specifically child-centered form at all. Right? When he's talking, he's just talking about, mostly it sounds like he's talking about grown-ups. And grown-ups just pissing the time away, wasting time, killing time, I could just see people sitting on a spare playing cards, talking trash or something like that. Perhaps this is because the spoudios whom Aristotle seeks is a mature man, whereas a child is necessarily immature. Nonetheless, children certainly do not play to kill time in the manner of the fool's diagoge. Their play is not foolish at all in this way. Indeed, as Johann Heutzinger remarks in his excellent book Homo Ludens, play lies outside the antithesis of wisdom and folly. That is, children's play cannot be condemned as folly, nor can it be held to account for not embodying Sophia. In fact, inasmuch as children play, they do so free from all such dualisms. Their play is free from all moral, rational, and practical constraints. Right? You've played games that had very little to do with the moral, rational, and practical constraints in ordinary life, right, folks? As Heutzinger puts it, play lies outside the antithesis of wisdom and folly, and equally outside those of truth and falsehood, good and evil. The valuations of vice and virtue don't apply here. In this regard, children's play is not at all dissimilar to philosophy, which in its sublime form seeks beyond all dualisms, beyond both good and evil, beyond the purview of discursive thought and reasoning, for a true ground in the one. Snoopy and Lucy playing there. Children's paideia cannot be rightly criticized using Aristotle's conception of play as time-wasting, as diagoge, simply by the fact that it is a voluntary activity. Unlike diagoge, which arises from the experience of time as a constraint, and from the desire to be rid of the liberty one has, in which one might enjoy scholae, the child's paideia is inherently free, right? I mean, here you've got an older person, I just picture, right, or a human being in front of you who has some, quote, free time, but doesn't know what to do with himself. And so he engages in just, basically stupidity, right? Just doing whatever, just to kill the time. He can't live in his own skin. He can't stand not having anything to do. When you've got nothing to do, you can get up to bad news, right? So that's the diagoge stuff. But unlike that, which arises from the experience of time as a constraint and from the desire to be rid of that liberty that you have, in which you might enjoy scholae, the child's paideia is inherently free, see? Child and animal play because they enjoy playing, and therein precisely lies their freedom. In this regard, even the play of animals transcends the pastimes of the foolish men Aristotle criticizes, for both the play of children and of animals originates from a place of freedom rather than from the desire to shirk one's freedom. In the case of the foolish men, the desire to be rid of the opportunity to cultivate their highest freedom in scholae. Child's play is further distinguished from diagoge by its disinterest in ordinary life. Whereas where the man engaged in diagoge attempts to rise above normal ordinary affairs through killing time, he nonetheless does so only because he is still thinking of those affairs, sometimes seeking notoriety in the eyes of others for his stature as tyrant, or perhaps for his abilities as the tyrant's favorite and sycophant. At other times, the fool engages in diagoge as a means to escape the grueling nature of his work, rather than participate in a form of play that is good in its own right. This is just an example that Aristotle takes up, right? Child's play, however, is quite different from the spiritual weakness or infirmity. Not being ordinary life, it stands outside the immediate satisfaction of wants and appetites. Indeed, it interrupts the appetitive process. Given its disinterest in worldly affairs, if play may be adequately defined as an action accomplishing itself outside and above the necessities and seriousness of everyday life, then how is child's play much different from what the lover of wisdom does in the pursuit of Sophia? The child, like the one pursuing wisdom, engages freely in an activity for its own sake, that is pleasurable as its own end, and that transcends all worldly affairs in its focus. Children's paideia, like philosophy, thus has its place in a sphere superior to the strictly biological processes of nutrition, reproduction, and self-preservation. See, it's an awful lot like philosophy in those regards, right? Aristotle versus Calvin and Hobbes, cage match. All of these observations about children's paideia are made in contrast to Aristotle's assessment of play. It's true that Aristotle is silent in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics about children in relation to Theoria and happiness. However, some inferences about the matter seem fair. All right, he doesn't mention them, but we can infer from what he said what his ideas and his opinions of children are. As we've seen, not only does Aristotle voice a certain disdain for children elsewhere, enumerating them alongside wild animals in their capacity for mindless yet natural virtue, he also denies the possibility of guiding them in the pursuit of Sophia, inasmuch as they are said to lack any consciousness of the originary experiences or beginning things that are foundational to such a pursuit. To the extent that Aristotle denies that children have the ability to engage in such anamnetic experiences, we must consider whether he truly recognizes the spiritual height and depth of a child's consciousness. Does he really get kids, folks? That's the big question. Johann Huitzinger, for instance, writes that when a child plays, he is quite literally beside himself with delight, transported beyond himself, to such an extent that he almost believes he's actually such and such a thing, without, however, wholly losing consciousness of ordinary reality. Given that children, in their rich and imaginative lives, are capable of such spiritual transports, one might wonder why they would be incapacitated for recollection of originary experiences. Indeed, what are we to make of Socrates dialoguing, not only with high school-age boys, but even with young children, interrupting them in the Lyceum, in the place of school, while they're playing at wrestling and knucklebones? How is it that philosophy is not, in Plato's dialogues at least, an elite pursuit, but rather something to be undertaken alongside children's games and contests? Socrates does it, why can't we do it? Right? Huitzinger remarks, "It would seem that we are accustomed to think of play and seriousness as an absolute antithesis. It would seem, however, that this does not go to the heart of the matter. In his 7th letter, Plato tells us that every serious or mature man, i.e. every spudaios, avoids writing about serious things. And so, it might not be much of a stretch here to suppose that philosophy, at least as Plato has written about it, is not a serious but rather a playful thing. Indeed, in his Laws, Plato describes human beings as divine playthings. Our lot in life is to play in a manner that is pleasing to the god, following the tugs that we feel upon our strings as divine puppets. Inasmuch as we are willing to play this sacred game, we're animated and divine ourselves, but to the extent that we refuse to play or to respond to the god's tugs, we're merely bags of meat hanging on a string." Huitzinger, too, makes this observation when he links play to our connection with sacred things. He says, in play we may move below the level of the serious, as a child does, but we can also move above it in the realm of the beautiful and the sacred. Returning then to Aristotle's elucidation concerning the relevance of pursuing wisdom for happiness, He delineates happiness as activity in accordance with the highest virtue in the best part of us. That's what happiness is. Let me read you his definition. Happiness is the activity in accordance with the highest virtue in the best part of us. Aristotle esteems the intellect, or nous, as this best part. And although he is unsure of whether it's actually divine, or simply the most divine part of us, he nonetheless says that it is that portion of our being that's empowered to know what is noble and divine. It's the activity of the nous in accordance with the virtue proper to it that will constitute perfect happiness for human beings. This activity, Aristotle reiterates, is contemplation. Contemplation, or Theoria, says Aristotle, is the highest form of activity, since the nous is the highest thing in us, and the objects with which the nous deals are the highest things that can be known. Theoria is also said to be superior to all other forms of energia because it is the most continuous. That is, we can engage in it longer than we can carry on any other form of action. Moreover, Theoria is thought to be the most pleasurable form of activity, since it alone is in accordance with Sophia, which is itself the highest virtue. It is for this reason that Aristotle claims that the life in pursuit of wisdom is the most pleasurable of lives. All right, so that's a lot to take in for today, folks. We can have a class discussion around what you've thought about Aristotle here. We can ask questions. One of the maybe big questions is, do Aristotle's remarks about contemplation fit with schools? The problems of the modern classroom and their dissonance with Aristotle's discussion of Theoria, Scholae, and Sophia are not merely a problem for student learning, they're also a problem in the contemplative scholastic life of the teacher. Recall your own experiences with endless busy work, useless meetings, and the tunnel vision focus on assessment of student performance in the mastery of their schoolwork. All of these things prevent us from exercising our leisure, or even realizing what leisure really means, right? However, given that a good many teachers feel this way, that the system is a paternalistic insult to our intelligence, that it's an accusation against our professionalism, that it's an indication of distrust on the part of our administrative and provincial superiors, ought not we as well reconsider how we view our students' leisure? If we feel that we ought to be allowed to learn the meaning of Scholae through encounter with it, and thereby learn through familiarity with the experience how to enjoy our Scholae as true scholastics, then ought not it be our prime concern to turn our students into scholars as well? Rather than stifling the possibility for developing a wisdom atmosphere of leisure and thereby discouraging the cultivation of Theoria, ought we not, as teachers, take it as our mission to help our students learn how to enjoy their leisure, rather than grow up to become foolish men of whom Aristotle speaks, who simply kill time until they die? As we earlier remarked about child's play, children may be more naturally disposed to leisure than we suppose. Certainly adults have been known to kill time at work, because work can indeed be drudgery. Work can be busy work, devoid of meaning and joy. And the older students get, the more they too become initiated into this adult world of work and drudgery. We can, and very often do, experience work not as a source of pleasure, but as a means of social control, as a means to keep us in order and to prevent us from exercising the freedom that we might enjoy by coming into an awareness of the meaning of Scholae and the opportunity it affords for wisdom's pursuit. Indeed, it seems reasonable to suppose that the busyness that is imposed on teachers and students is itself the cause of much killing of time. For what else is there to do when school is not scholae but schoolwork? Could it be that always keeping students and teachers busy is not the solution to the problem of idleness, but rather that it exacerbates the problem by not providing us opportunity in which to learn how to be scholastic, philosophic, or contemplative? In this course, I propose that we ought to turn around, the Greek word is periagage, turn around our souls from our present course. In some small way, we ought to pursue the wisdom that the ancients intuited and felt as the pleasure of gazing upon the highest, but also the deepest things. If we could structure our days in school so that they fostered a wisdom environment that lends itself at least occasionally to scholae and the practice of Theoria, our students, and we too as teachers, would be happier, as Aristotle suggests. For happiness is an activity in accordance with the highest virtue in the best part of us. This part of us ought to be cultivated, not simply in its dianoetic powers of critical analysis, as we do now, but also in recognition of the higher capacities and functioning of noesis. Aristotle distinguishes the active life and its practical pursuits from the contemplative life and its concern with seeing, or theoria, calling the former unleisured and directed to some further end not chosen for their own sake, whereas the latter embodies the meaning of true scholia. The theoretic activity of the intellect excels its practical activities in seriousness. It is the activity of the nous that constitutes complete human happiness. However, Aristotle writes that the aspect of our lives that participates in scholae, which we are able to cultivate or practice gazing upon the highest things, is higher than the human level. For not in virtue of his humanity will a man achieve it, but in virtue of something within him that is divine. In this regard, Aristotle bids all human beings, not simply grown men or so-called philosophers, but all of us, to immortalize or athanatizein. Certainly Aristotle voices his doubts about the abilities of a variety of sorts of people, youth and children included, to pursue Sophia. But he's quite clear that Sophia is indeed the greatest good, and that scholae and theoria are essential for human beings who wish truly to receive any sort of immortalizing education. Aristotle, therefore, serves as an excellent example of the extent to which our educational focus upon the middle, upon the strictly human and mortal, an assessment of the critical analytic elements of education is not an education aimed at the pursuit of wisdom, and therefore not an education aimed at directing us towards happiness. Indeed, modern-day education, in its emphasis on efficiency in work, does not even rise to the level of children's games or play, inasmuch as the concerns of our middle educational strategies do not rise above the strictly biological processes of nutrition, reproduction, and self-preservation to which they are ultimately harnessed. The full amplitude of our human being is not explored by such an education. Students are not challenged to investigate the depths or the heights of things. They're not even given the opportunity to be able or to be made aware of these extremes without the proper wisdom atmosphere, without a recognition of the value of scholae. Rather, our current atmosphere serves, if anything, to stifle and to discourage any such awareness of the need to athanatizein. Questions and comments we can take up in class on Aristotle. There sure is a lot here. Don't panic if some of it just you didn't get it. We can talk about it together, explore it in the ways that are best suited to your own learning, and I'll see you then. Thank you.